Our next speaker, it's really a pleasure to introduce. This is Ryan Indigo Warman. He is one of the fellow founding members of ERIE once upon a time when we were all together in a class about 4 years ago. Susanna Bustos taught an entheogenic shamanism class. So he's kind of been our cannabis policy man since the get-go, which is fantastic. And today he's going to be touching on a different topic, which is really interesting. I have yet to hear him speak to 5-MeO-DMT, and that's going to be his topic today, sort of integrated with his dissertation proposal, which is looking at a science fiction work. It's really been an awesome pleasure to know Indigo over the last couple years, and I really always enjoy his talks. So sit back, enjoy, and a big round of applause for Ryan Indigo Warman.
All right, thank you, Larry. That was a stellar introduction, so I feel like I can just kind of dive in. So my talk today is on something called macro contact, which is a concept from a science fiction novel that I'm going to introduce in a minute. The subtext is the idea of non-dual experience as a strange attractor, and I'm going to explain that concept as well. First, a little snapshot of my dissertation research. Its title is Images of the Great Turning, Utopian Visions in New Age Science Fiction. And these are the three categories that have emerged in the course of my research, going on like 15 years now. The ecotopian category, based on the book of the same name. The divine feminine category, which includes the fifth sacred thing that I imagine some of you have read, as well as the Gaia Codex, a new book by a woman named Sarah Drew, which I cannot recommend enough. Also in the conscious evolution category, the book Cloud Atlas, which was recently adapted into a movie, and the novel 2150 AD, from which the macro contact concept comes, so that will be the focus of my talk this evening. But first, let me try to explain the concept of the strange attractor, which is basically a systems theory, mathematical systems theory concept applied to society. So our East-West Department Chair Craig Chalquist wrote that strange attractors derive from nonlinear charting of chaotically varying quantities. They're examples of fractals, and so much love to Denise for bringing that wonderful fractal artwork to us. It's all going to relate. Basically, it's a way of charting a chaotic equation. So you have an assortment of chaotic points in a nonlinear equation. There seems to be no pattern, but when viewed over time, like if you could see this spiral drawn out, it would start out looking chaotic and random, and then a pattern would very quickly appear. Much similar to the Mandelbrot set, which is one of the most easily recognizable fractals. Up close it looks chaotic, expanded, the beautiful pattern appears at each different level of expansion. This is applied to social theory by a number of people, including Dr. Chalquist and a guy named Chris Lucas, because social systems are invariably complex. Many people doing many things many times, and each having many different values and interests. It's traditional to assume that there can be a single answer and to scientifically analyze the system until we find it. Yet complex systems have many answers, and we must look to new techniques in order to deal with them. So what this essentially is systems theory as a way of looking at paradigms or worldviews, specifically the underlying assumptions or concepts that create a worldview. So in the case of the modern or industrial worldview, it's the idea that the earth is an unconscious collection of natural resources for us to exploit at our leisure. And after 150 years of this industrial revolution, we're seeing the effect that that is having on our planet. Dr. Chalquist also writes that when complex planetary systems eventually wear out, their dissipative structures reach the brink of chaos, where the system either redesigns itself or falls apart. So what we're really talking about are strange attractors of meaning. A researcher named Vladimir Dimitrov writes that meaning has a fractal structure. And he describes how these strange attractors of meaning can exhort or inform human actions, because without those meanings we're basically going through physical motions. So again, it's a systems theory way of conceptualizing how we create meaning. Dimitrov goes on to say that meanings which tend to preserve their stability become dogmas, and these dogmas impede the emergence of new strange attractors of meaning. So we can see this in things like climate change denial and the war on women and any other number of nonsense coming out of a number of states that shall for the moment remain nameless. I would personally argue that the strange attractors of modernity are money and power, with an underlying subtext of sex or the commercialization of sex to almost everything. These things being the way to achieve true happiness in life, as we're told. So Dr. Chalquist has offered an alternative viewpoint in his groundbreaking essay on the earthrise image, which if you haven't read, again, cannot recommend this work enough. And he specifically cites this image that was taken on Christmas Eve, rather poetically, of 1968, just before the big countercultural revolution started. And Dr. Chalquist, along with a number of other people, proposed this as the catalyst for the new emerging worldview, which I like to call the integral worldview, even though there's a lot of debate as to exactly what that means. Joseph Campbell said that a new mythos is an underlying meta-story to furnish collective psychic structure for how to relate this society to the world of nature and the cosmos. Campbell, in his interview with Bill Moyers shortly before he died, goes on to talk about the society of the planet that is ruled by the eye of reason, a philosophy of the planet as a conscious living entity. And Campbell specifically cites this as what he thinks the new myth of our time will be. He goes on to talk about moving beyond the nation-state paradigm. Dr. Chalquist specifically quotes about a half-dozen astronauts who had transcendental experiences when seeing the Earth from space for the first time without any national borders. So, why am I talking about science fiction? I just want to say something about that really quick. I've found another very compelling source, researcher named Alexei Panshin, who comes right out and says that science fiction is the new myth of the modern West. And there is actually quite a bit of research on Star Trek and other forms of science fiction, how they have informed our cultural and technological development over the decades. I believe that visionary fiction imagines where we may grow as a culture, for better or worse, and the New Age flavors of science fiction endeavored to envision a desirable future, however we might define that. I personally want to redefine the concept of utopia as being an egalitarian world that works for everyone, and I'm going to get into how that might be structured. So this macro philosophy from the novel 2150 AD is essentially a New Age neo-romantic idealism, the idea that everything in the universe is connected, from the smallest micron atom to the largest galaxy cluster. There's a number of different threads for this into the New Age philosophy that are identified by a Dutch researcher named Hanegraaff Wouter, who wrote this exhaustive analysis of the New Age movement. What I'll say here is essentially that the ultimate source holism, the idea that all of creation emanates from a singular source, is something that has found its way into the New Age movement via Kabbalah and Hermeticism and some of the other mystery traditions. And the universal interrelatedness would include what's called the bootstrap philosophy or parallelism, as well as systems theory and the holographic paradigm, which you may be familiar with. So in this macro society, this macro philosophy is basically the ethos of a global integral civilization, which I'm going to unpack this concept in a few slides. The heart of this civilization is universal education, conscious evolution, and a non-dual experience called macro contact. I find it very fascinating that non-dual experiences and ayahuasca or DMT journeys in general are often described with fractal visuals. And again, thank you, Denise, for that wonderful visual display preceding this. Couldn't have asked for any better introduction. This is a description of the macro contact from the novel 2150 AD, which, as I've said, in this fictional future civilization, they've developed the ability to trigger this non-dual experience without an entheogenic substance, using fractal visuals and sonic waves, sound waves. And the main protagonist says that I seem to enter an infinite ocean of unspeakable unity, oneness, and balance, accompanied by the most soul-satisfying experience of harmony imaginable. That brings us to the actual entheogen, 5-MeO-DMT. One of the most prominent academic voices that has studied this medicine and worked with it is Dr. Martin Ball. And he writes, "The experience is a feeling of total surrender to the direct presence of or union with God. It is readily comparable to Hindu experiences of moksha or Buddhist experiences of samadhi and nirvana. The user will generally experience a full entry into complete God consciousness, total ego dissolution, and energetic expansion into the totality of the universe. Users generally describe their experiences as entering into a state of divine grace, being enfolded in the pure energy of love, becoming one with the mind of God, and experiencing the true nature of reality." Now, what this is a +4 experience on the Shulgin rating scale, developed by Alexander Shulgin. He says that these are completely separate from the +1, +2, and +3, which are basically different categories of a effect and duration of an entheogen. Shulgin writes that it's a rare and precious transcendental state, which has been called a peak experience, a religious experience, or a divine transformation, a state of samadhi, and many other names. It is a state of bliss, a participation mystique, a connectedness with both the interior and exterior universes, which has come about after the ingestion of a psychedelic drug, but which is not necessarily repeatable with the subsequent ingestion of the same drug. And we find this same subjective element present in the way that the macro contact is described. Shulgin writes that if a drug or technique or process were ever to be discovered which would consistently produce a +4 experience in all human beings, it is conceivable that it would signal the ultimate evolution and perhaps the end of the human experiment. Now, when I read that, I immediately think of this idea of the end of history, which is another very big philosophical concept that I'm not going to attempt to unpack entirely here. I'm just going to give a few bullet points about it. The idea is the end point of humanity's social, cultural evolution and the final form of human government. Kant wrote the idea for a universal history with a cosmopolitan purpose. He extolled the idea that people would be able to think with determination and courage to think for themselves without the direction of another. This is actually a very anarchistic idea of inner self-governance. Hegel's phenomenology of spirit imagined humanity progressing through these different ways of interpreting our relationship to the earth. And as I've said, right now our interpretation of the earth is as a lifeless collection of minerals and substances for us to exploit. And that has a subsequent effect on our worldviews and our whole structure of our civilization. Heidegger was a bit of a doomsayer. He felt like the whole world was headed towards total war, which would either be the ultimate revelation of being or would degenerate humanity to a state where we were all either scientists, workers, or brutes. And he saw Americanism or capitalism, Marxism, and fascism as the dominant ideologies, all of which are just different shades of institutionalized nihilism. He was also very fearful of a totalitarian world technology, which I think we're going to hear a little bit more about from one of our next presenters. Francis Fukuyama wrote his essay, The End of History, and subsequent book in 1992, basically believing that we had reached this end of history with the advent of Western neoliberal democracy. I would say flat out that he's wrong. This neoliberal democracy is not the pinnacle of human evolution, and all we need to do is read the news. That's basically like saying that we live in post-racial America. It's hogwash. This is a very interesting book that was recently published, very short pamphlet-like book, The Collapse of Western Civilization by Oreskes and Conway, written as a piece of science-based fiction from the perspective of a future historian in the year 2393, reflecting on the 300-year anniversary of the Great Collapse, which this is 2093, but the authors flat out say they just picked that date because it was very far away, could easily happen sooner than that. And they basically make the point that it's neoliberal democracy's marriage to capitalism as the only possible form of organization for a free society, which has given all the power to the corporations and essentially, as we speak, paralyzed our response to the very obvious warnings of climate change. An alternative to these versions of the end of history I would propose would be a true meritocracy. And I would say from the course of my research that the macro society in 2150 is not a benevolent dictatorship, nor is it an enlightened despotism, because it has democratically elected leaders at all of its levels. And it's a very metric and decentralized progression from group homes of 10 to communities of 100, neighborhoods of 1,000 that form small settlements of 10,000 that are decentralized all over the globe. This is also a reconstructed post-collapse society with a much smaller global population. But it's a meritocracy that works with one person, one vote because the population is evenly distributed. And that could never work in our current federal system unless the population of all 50 states were evenly distributed. So this is a map of what that would look like, and I sincerely apologize if there are any Texans in the audience. Texans are very attached to the shape of their state. But I mean, with gerrymandering and all the other ridiculous things that go on in our supposedly representative democracy, this doesn't actually seem like that bad of an idea. So that brings us to really the alternative that I would like to advance, which would be a meritocracy-based global integral civilization. And Sally Goerner wrote a very short but beautiful study about this in 2007 called Today's Copernican Flip, where she's basically comparing the Copernican revolution to the advent of what she calls a collaborative learning culture, which she sees as a natural outgrowth of our social development when looked at through the lens of complexity theory. She says that societies are a knowledge ecology, an information processing ecosystem. Goerner argues against the idea that humans are inherently greedy. She cites cultural corruption, inequality, and specifically a deeply ingrained oligarchic culture. You might have seen this study making the rounds on Facebook last year, the quote-unquote Princeton oligarchy study. A researcher from Princeton and another one from Northwestern wrote a study called Testing Theories of American Democracy, where they did a philosophical proof that we no longer live in a representative democracy. It is a corporate oligarchy by the numbers. Goerner argues that some hierarchy is necessary, that it functions like the brain and the nervous system. I would argue that oligarchy is essentially elitism and classism. Goerner says that oligarchic cultures invariably destroy themselves, and she makes a case for collective creativity and universal learning being at the heart of a civilization. Moving on, I discovered an amazing article using some of Aurobindo's work, Sri Aurobindo, sort of the patron saint of California Institute of Integral Studies. Tristan Gulliford, this article is posted on the Evolver website, realitysandwich.com. The title is Sri Aurobindo's Radical Social Vision, the Possibility of a Telepathic Utopia. Gulliford says this is a thought experiment based on Sri Aurobindo's ideal of human unity, in which he expounds at length on his ideas for a future world state, an integral world state, or the alternatives. In the ideal of human unity, he speaks about the religion of humanity, Aurobindo, the highest active ideal of mankind, would spiritualize itself and become the inner law of human life. The fact that Gulliford is using the idea of telepathy, one of the yogic cities, as another strange attractor, creating an underlying psychic unity of humanity that itself gives rise to a more authentic form of government. Gulliford also argues that America has become a corporate oligarchy, and he even goes so far as to call it a fascist oligarchy. Gulliford writes, "Here I am adopting the incendiary term fascist with well-thought intent. I mean this designation in the same sense that the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini meant it when he said that fascism is the merger of corporate and state power." So, in The Ideal of Human Unity, which Aurobindo wrote in 1915 and revised and heavily footnoted following the First and Second World Wars, he foresaw two possible outcomes: a centralized and possibly totalitarian world state, or a peaceful federation or even decentralized confederation of nations with the best interests and highest good of humanity as its highest value. Aurobindo said that the saving power needed is a new psychological factor which will at once make a united life necessary to humanity and force it to respect the principle of freedom. Alan Kaslev writes about the idea of supramentalization on a world scale and how salvation essentially becomes a collective affair. So, the alternative that I hope to see manifested in my children or grandchildren's lifetimes, I believe we're seeing the seeds of it now, a global integral civilization. In the novel 2150, it's a global egalitarian civilization where everyone's needs are provided for. Its highest value is conscious evolution, which facilitates a non-dual experience that they call macro contact. The development of yogic cities or powers, and again, thank you, Denise, for bringing in these extra senses that are forbidden to talk about. The development of these powers manifest the co-creative potential of reality, and these are some of the other strange attractors of this imagined future civilization. So I would say, as my final thought, and doing a little riff and paraphrase on Shulgin's +4, if a sacred medicine or technique were developed that could consistently trigger a non-dual experience in all humans, it could perhaps become the new mythic experience or rite of passage, like the Eleusinian mysteries for the emerging integral worldview. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indigo. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. One back here.
Thank you, Indigo. Referring back to your, well, you just reinstated it here. What is it? Shulgin's comment about if they had this kind of substance that consistently blah blah. So I wondered if you compared that to Huxley's discussion of similar circumstances in Ireland and other things where a dystopian future is one where, or THX 1138, where everybody is medicated into a neutral soup and easily manipulated.
Or Brave New World.
Roger that.
Yeah.
So can you address that?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that one of our next presenters is going to be really diving into the idea of cognitive liberty, but that's really what this is about. Not only the ability to think freely, but to freely ponder the interconnected nature of society and civilization and perhaps the cosmos itself. It's like Gulliford, where he's citing Aurobindo, the idea that if we had some sort of shared experience, and I've been saying this for years, I was hoping something magically cosmic would happen on December 21st, 2012. But some sort of shared experience that awakens us to the underlying unity of humanity. And I think we see that in different flavors and shades in the entire entheogenic and psychedelic world. There's always, of course, the shadow of it. But I think that what I'm essentially saying here is that these entheogenic experiences have more or less always been at the heart of the emerging counterculture. And that is where I see the seeds of this emerging integral worldview. So it's important that we do these explorations, and this is why that most of these substances are illegal, because they challenge the status quo, they challenge the power over dominant paradigm, and forbidding us to use these sacred medicines actually disempowers us.
Question. You mentioned that rite of passage or mythic experience of non-dual experience, comparing it to Eleusinian. Yeah. Could you kind of help me position that a little by explaining the mysteries, or?
Yes, of course. The Eleusinian mysteries were practiced in ancient Greece for about 2,000 years. It was a thing that united all of the cultures and different classes of the ancient world, and there is a strong counter-explanation for this, that this brew called the Kyrkion that the initiates drank when they entered into the innermost chamber was essentially a psychedelic brew. And I've heard another researcher whom I respect very much say that they think that they have identified it as ergotized barley. Ergotized rye, ergot is a mold that is a precursor to LSD and was likely completely infesting the grain silos of the Salem colony. They think that it was the cause of the witch trials. So if they were similarly deliberately cultivating the ergot on barley and then making a kind of beer with it, it would be intensely psychedelic, especially if they had figured out other MAO inhibitors, things that were occurring naturally that they could add to the brew. So there's a lot of debate about this, but I think in this circle, most people who know of the Eleusinian mysteries would tend to think that there was some sort of psychedelic component to them. And there were also, the initiates were sworn to secrecy under penalty of death to reveal what they saw during the initiation. So we don't really know, but I think that I don't see how something like that could have functioned without an entheogenic component. Yeah.
Thank you for everything you shared. You're very well read, and you're onto something big.
Thank you.
What you just said earlier about a shared global experience, what you were hoping for on December 2012. This isn't a question I have. It's more of just a comment because it just triggered. I thought I'd just share briefly a little experience I had at the foot of the Teton Mountains in Wyoming. And
Please.
To make a really long vision short, the entire globe, the thin air between you and me, it basically ohmed alive at the perfect moment when humanity is ready. And so no matter where you are, if you're in Fiji or in Moscow or you're in Washington, there is no way you can deny it. So the whole world wakes up at once. And we wake up to the realization that the earth is alive. So we feel it inside, we feel it outside. It's like, that's the quantum shift. I pray for that. We'll see. But I just thought I'd share that.
Thank you. Yeah, I pray for that too, and I absolutely agree. I feel like there was an activation that happened on the winter solstice of 2012, and to wish for some sort of like grand display is a little bit of escapism that I fell prey to as much as anyone else in the who identifies with the New Age movement. But I feel like, just as you said, it'll happen when we're ready, and it's also happening right now. Okay.
Thank you very much as well for this incredible talk. Not that it's up to me to say it's incredible. I'd just like to ask a couple questions, or at least just one. You're talking about some of the terminology. I'd like to throw an idea at you that is a similar thing real quick, which is
Sure.
equal empowerment distribution equilibrium. And you talked also at the very end here about disempowerment. And I guess my question for you is, on the board right there, it seems that part of the, I guess my question is part of the conclusion here that the power, we are giving our power to entheogens to allow for this liberation? And I do support entheogens, having had a lot of experience myself and been liberated. But I would just ask the idea, is there a way that we can be, is there a way that we can live that does not give our power to something external to ourselves, if they are external to ourselves, but that we may live in such a way as to globally realize this equilibrium, regardless of whether we have entheogenic powers at our disposal or not?
It's a very good question. And there is no simple answer, but what I would say is that, and this is a pretty common belief, I would hope, in entheogenic circles, an entheogen can open the door, it can show you a different conception or way of seeing reality, but it can't do the work for you. So, you know, dependence on an entheogen, or even dependence on a non-entheogenic non-duality like the macro contact, is explored a little bit in the novel. It's actually a theme that I want to explore a little bit more. I'm considering maybe proposing writing a sequel to the book at some point to the author. So yeah, it can open the door, it can't do the work for you. And in the narrative, in the novel 2150, the protagonist achieves the macro contact on his first try, which is considered to be a big deal, but then he tries several more times and he doesn't quite get there. So there's a subjective element to it, the subjective human element to it, and one of the biggest parts of that is attachment, right? So the more that we're attached to an experience like that, paradoxically, the harder it is actually to achieve. But that's part of the shadow and part of the work that we have to do. Hope that answers.
I'm excited about your new definition of utopia, a world that works for everyone. And I thought it would be cool if you would say some words about how your definition is divergent from the other definitions of utopia, or prior definitions.
Thank you also for bringing that up. The word utopia was coined by Thomas More in 1608, about a year before Martin Luther nailed his 99 Theses to the Wittenberg chapel door. So you could very easily make the case that the concept of utopia is as old as modernity itself, seen to really begin with that big challenge to the church authority. The actual root of the word is a bit tongue-in-cheek, because the Greek root ou, which is pronounced you, means good. So utopia is the good place. But the identically pronounced eu in the Greek root means no. So utopia is also the not place, or the no place, or the unachievable perfect society. And that's what people think of when they hear the word utopia. There was some stupid TV show on Fox last year that lasted like half a season and got pulled. Totally not surprised. Because they put a bunch of random conflicting personalities together and said, okay, now go and create a perfect civilization, and, you know, never mind the Fox editors working behind the scenes. So, yeah, there's a lot of people who think that when Thomas More coined the word, he was being a little sarcastic. He was doing a play on words, a double entendre, if you will. But the philosophies that he puts forth in that book are completely contrary to what he practiced and perhaps had to practice as the Lord Chancellor, basically the Attorney General in our modern speech, of Great Britain. So there's a lot there, and you know, my external reader, Dr. Craig Schindler, is one of the originators of the idea of the Great Turning, and he speaks about Martin Luther King's vision of the beloved community, which will require an inner change in the quality of our soul and an outer change in the quantity of our compassionate action. And that's from Dr. King's victory speech from the Montgomery bus boycotts. So that's my utopia. My utopia is the beloved community. My utopia is a civilization where we don't have this massive concentration of wealth, which would enable us to actually take care of every living human being, not having to be stepping over homeless people whom I deeply care about and their plight when we walk out of this building into San Francisco's Mission District. We just attended a great End Homelessness town hall a couple weeks ago. A lot of innovative things in San Francisco going on around that, and it's still not enough. And there's still laws being passed that make it illegal to be poor and illegal to be homeless, when there's nowhere else for some people to go. So, yeah, the utopia is the good place, not the perfect place, maybe just the good place, the good life, an egalitarian, sustainable, consciously evolving society.
Woo! Thank you very much, Indigo.
All right. On that note, thank you guys.